Think about this for a second. If you get wronged in your hometown, say somebody steals your car or, heaven forbid, breaks into your house, what exactly do you do? Well, you call a police, right? You've got a domestic legal system to fall back on, a really clear set of rules, and actual authorities whose job it is to enforce them. But let's scale that up to the realm of international relations. What happens when a whole country is attacked? What recourse does a sovereign nation have when it's wronged? The chilling truth here is that on the global stage, there is absolutely no higher authority to call. To borrow a pretty striking phrase from our sources, there is literally no 9/11 for planet Earth. It's a terrifying reality, honestly, but it's fundamentally true. If a dictator somewhere just decides to cross a border and invade a neighboring country, there is no overarching automatic global police force that's going to just show up with sirens blaring to slap handcuffs on them. For the most part, nations are entirely on their own. And that brings us to the fundamental premise of what scholars call structural anarchy. In international relations, because there isn't some global guarantor of safety, the world basically operates as a self-help system. Literally every single state has to relentlessly seek power, security, and autonomy just to survive. And because that survival is never guaranteed, today's best ally can incredibly easily become tomorrow's worst enemy. So welcome to The Explainer. Today, our goal is to rotate a theoretical prism, so to speak, to decode the invisible machinery that is operating right behind your daily global headlines. We're going to focus specifically on one massive question. In a world without a global police force, how do international institutions actually shape order and prevent total chaos? Let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll establish the baseline reality of the global anarchy problem. Then, we'll look through three completely distinct theoretical lenses to see how the world tries to solve this. Realism, where institutions are just tools of power. Liberalism, where they act as webs of restraint. And constructivism, where they shape global norms. Finally, we'll synthesize this global order so you can read the evening news like a total expert. All right, starting off with Section 1, the global anarchy problem, or navigating a world without a CEO. Ever since the secular system of independent sovereign states was established by the Peace of Westphalia way back in 1648, the massive catch for the world has been this concept of anarchy. But remember, and this is super important, in this context, anarchy doesn't mean rioting in the streets or absolute chaos. It simply means there is no centralized global authority. There's no world CEO sitting at the very top of the pyramid dictating terms to everyone else. The globe is essentially this massive, completely unregulated free market of sovereign nations acting entirely on their own behalf. Before we get into how institutions fit into this whole puzzle, we need to contrast our two main actors. Realists look at the globe and see states as identical, rigid billiard balls. What's going on inside them doesn't really matter. They just bump into each other, strictly focused on survival and raw power. Liberals, on the other hand, view the state kind of like a modern smartphone. The government itself is just the operating system, right? It's just a transmission belt executing the apps or the domestic preferences of its own citizens and internal interest groups. That brings us to Section 2, realism and the tools of power. So looking through the realist lens, we have to view the world a bit more coldly and, well, calculatingly. Power, security, and state autonomy are literally the only things that truly matter. Morality and utopian ideals, those are totally stripped away. In this view, international institutions aren't peace-loving charities. They are highly calculated instruments of state power. Which brings us to a core realist survival tactic, external balancing. Say you're a weaker state, and you're terrified of a dominant power next door. What do? You pool your military and economic capabilities with other states. You form an alliance to structurally protect yourself. However, as our sources point out, this comes with the severe risk of entrapment, meaning getting dragged into an ally's war that doesn't actually serve your own national interests at all. Now, when we map this theory onto the real world, we see that realists view international bodies strictly as calculated structural shields against unipolar dominance. Whether you're talking about NATO expanding as a political and military shield, nations utilizing the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for security, or the BRICS Plus network creating the new development bank to balance against Western economic unipolarity, these are not utopian talking shops. From the realist perspective, they are deliberate, strategic moves on a giant global chessboard to ensure survival. Let's shift gears to Section 3, liberalism and webs of restraint. Let's pivot our energy here to something that feels a lot more structural and engineered. If realism is all about raw external power, liberalism argues that the internal setup,
The domestic society is actually what dictates global peace and conflict. Under liberalism, a state's foreign policy is basically just a reflection of what its citizens actually want. To explain how this leads to peace, we turn to the philosopher Immanuel Kant and his theory of the Kantian tripod. He argued that perpetual peace between nations requires three interlocking legs to hold it up. First, constitutional caution, meaning democracies hesitate to go to war because the citizens paying the price actually have a vote. Second, transparent respect for international law. And third, global trade and free markets, which make going to war financially disastrous. When all three legs are present, the likelihood of these states fighting each other just drastically drops. Modern neoliberal institutionalism basically puts this theory into practice. Bodies like the World Trade Organization, the EU, or the UN are engineered solutions to systemic anarchy. They aren't magical peacekeepers. They're actually highly administrative structures that gather data, share information, and drastically reduce strategic uncertainty. But most importantly, they punish cheating. By engaging in these institutions, states lock in long-term cooperation and make the reputational costs of breaking the rules incredibly high. So the crucial takeaway here is that liberals use these institutions to build a cage to contain the leviathans. Going all the way back to thinkers like John Locke, the core fear is unchecked arbitrary power. Through international regimes, powerful liberal states actually voluntarily bind themselves to global rules. They build this intricate architecture of restraint to ensure no single state, not even themselves, can exercise raw, arbitrary power without absolute, transparent accountability. Moving on to Section 4, Constructivism and Shaping Global Norms. Now we transition to a much more sociological, human-centric framework. Constructivism completely rejects the idea that states are just unfeeling, calculating machines, like those billiard balls we talked about earlier. Instead, this theory explores how identity, history, shared values, and human perception actively build either cooperative or competitive security systems. There's this fantastic quote from scholar Martha Finnemore. Interests aren't just out there waiting to be discovered. They are constructed through social interaction. This is a massive shift. Constructivists are arguing that international institutions don't just constrain state power or facilitate trade, they actually create meaning. They shape the very social values that cause a state to decide what its national interest even is in the first place. In the real world, we see this in how institutions actively birth and diffuse new norms. For instance, UNESCO literally taught states to value and create science bureaucracies. The Red Cross drove the international acceptance of the Geneva Conventions, fundamentally changing the actual rules of war. The World Bank shifted global attitudes toward poverty alleviation. These institutions socially conditioned sovereign states to care about issues they historically would have just completely ignored. Finally, Section 5, Synthesizing the Global Order. So when we bring all these theories together, we can see exactly how sovereign actors try to provide for the common good in an anarchic world. These invisible, competing theories are the actual gears turning behind the scenes, and they directly dictate your daily realities, from the price of oil at your local gas pump to why you have to take your shoes off at airport security. You essentially have three paths. The dominance of realism, where hierarchical force imposes fast, but often resentful order. The reciprocity of liberalism, utilizing institutions to reward cooperation and punish defection. And the identity of constructivism, building shared values and deep community resilience, even if it is a bit slow to build. Together, these form the triad of global action. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and I want to leave you with a question. Now that you have this sort of murky X-ray machine to see the bones of global politics, I want you to look at the world around you. When you see a new trade deal signed, a border dispute escalate, or a climate summit convene, which invisible force do you think is truly driving tonight's evening news? Is it raw power, internal domestic preferences, or shared human norms? Keep that prism rotating in your mind, and suddenly the chaos of the world starts to make a whole lot of sense.